In the early days of Midgard, when men and women were first forging a path through the beautiful and fertile lands built for them by the gods, lived a wolf. A large grey wolf, the largest you've ever seen, and his name was Rita. Rita led a pack of equally impressive wolves, but he was by far the most ferocious and violent of the pack. No one challenged his rule. The pack did everything that he told them to do, without question. No matter the circumstances, his word was law. Some of the younger wolves would occasionally speak up and ask, "Why do we prey on the humans' cattle during the night, Rita? Why must we take from them where there's plentiful fruit bore from the trees around us? Why do we do these things, O Rita, the vengeful?"
"Silence,"
was all he said.
"I am your leader, and you'll do as I say."
Rita would snap and growl at these wolves, and as they grew older they moved on from these notions, as challenging Rita would always end in bloodshed. For years the wolves would torment the nearby town of Umbra, devouring their cattle and howling during the night time. The more they hit the village, the stronger the pack became, and soon Rita's pack had unrivaled dominance in the surrounding areas. But his seat of power remained within earshot of the village of Umbra. It was a humid summer night, and one of the members of the village was bathing in a pond at the edge of the forest to cool off. She was young and naive, and as she splashed about, the wolves watched on. They sat around without purpose, staring at the young human with a silent admiration, for she was brave to be playing so close to the trees. Rita's eyes were narrow, however, and saliva dripped from his pointed fangs. There had been no rule against conflict with the humans. It had simply not been necessary for the pack to humor this notion. But now, fat on the sweet meats of the goats and cows from the meadows of Umbra, Rita craved something new. He began stalking down from their perch towards the water's edge. The younger wolves began whimpering as he did so, knowing what was coming, but the older and more experienced followed their leader and began to skulk down beside him. No sooner had the villager seen the wolves did her playful cries turn to panicked yelps as she began to flee, but Rita and his followers were merciless and painted the ground red with her blood. After feasting on her flesh, the wolves howled a bloodthirsty, chilling howl, the type the villagers had never heard before, and they were struck down with fear. Rita, drunk on victory and the blood of youth, staggered back to his throne upon the hill overlooking Umbra, and fell into a deep slumber. It was the morning, when he lifted his gargantuan paws up underneath him and swayed on his unsteady feet. He licked his lips and tasted the dried blood from the young village girl the night before, and smiled. All knew of his power, all heard his howl and felt fear, for he was king. He opened his eyes slowly and looked upon the village that he so often tormented. But something was amiss.
"My pack," he said. "Where is my pack?"
Down in the village he saw men hefting great metal spears with sturdy oaken shafts, and clanking wooden tankards together in celebration. Mounted on pikes and stretched between racks was his pack, cut to pieces, skinned and mutilated.
How can this be?"
The humans with spears wore helmets and blue tunics, and were strong with thick arms. They barged themselves between the townsfolk who mourned for their lost daughter. They were mercenaries, brought on by the fury of the wolves, with a nose for gold and an appetite for death. How could his pack have been so weak, thought Rita. Without him at their head, were they truly so hopeless that these men in blue could easily slay them all? He seethed as he mourned in equal measures hate and anger before beginning a gallop down the hill towards the town. He would simply kill these men himself, and then begin to rebuild. He was Rita. He would not be denied. The rowdy men saw the gargantuan form of the wolf approaching from miles away, and sluggish and hungover that they pulled together shoulder to shoulder to form a wall of 100 razor-sharp spear tips. These were the most weathered and well-travelled of mercenaries, many of them being older than your average warrior with long grey beards tucked into their belts. But they were the strongest and bravest of men, brought together with hundreds of years of battle experience between them. Even dazed and still drunk from the night before, their discipline and training had them prepared for anything. As Rita galloped onward, anger began to give way to reason. The wall of spears grew ever larger, and the men stood still as the trees that surrounded his glen. They were unlike the townsfolk of Umbra. They feared nothing. He began to slow his approach, but at that point he was close enough to smell the beer on their breath and the sweat from their pits, and the men had encompassed his flank and had begun to close in around him, poking at his thick hide and even drawing his blood. The men cackled as Rita spun between them and spat and snarled. They played with him, bouncing his hulking carcass from one spear point to another.
"This one will make a nice trophy," said one of the men. "He's the biggest bloody wolf I've ever seen," said another. "We will take him as a celebration of our victory."
Then the crowd parted, allowing a few of the men to enter the circle with the snarling Rita, unarmed. Rita's jaws gnashed and threatened violence, but the men laughed and gestured to their brothers surrounding them, who gave them cheers in response. They circled the giant wolf, pulling his tail and slapping at his ears as if he were a pup. When Rita finally caught one of them with a slash from his jagged claws, the man simply rolled away and held up the bloody gash to a huge yell from the crowd. The men shouted. Seemingly satisfied, the 5 men surrounding Rita fell upon him, grasping each of his limbs and tying his jaws with rope. He was strung to a pole and paraded back through the streets of the village, provoking cries of horror from many of the townsfolk. But it just produced yet more laughter from the hardened mercenaries, for Rita was at their mercy. Rita, who was once king, was now their prisoner. The men had fashioned together a cage made of sturdy ash wood, with carved runes facing inward on Rita and outward towards the town. It was tall enough for Rita to stand on his hind legs within, but only just wide enough for him to lay down completely, and it had a cast iron door, specked with rust. The men in blue would come by once a day and offer meat, shaking it in his face and laughing at his snarls. He could make all the noise he liked. To them, he was just a caged rat. Sometimes they would get drunk and poke at him through the slats in the cage with their spears. The townsfolk would protest. "This has been the cause of our suffering for so long. Why must we keep it alive?" But the burly men insisted that Rita be kept imprisoned as a reminder of their strength. They had long outstayed their welcome, but the town of Umbra was powerless to their demands. The food was good and their women were warm. There was no need for them to move on without promise of solace beyond the harsh, snow-capped mountains that bordered the surrounding countryside. They had become just as burdensome to the town as the wolves had been at the peak of their power. Rita never dulled in his anger. His pride would not allow him to accept his fate. He gnawed at the wood and bashed his body against the iron door at all hours, but with no effect. His body was weakened, and his mind dulled. During the night he would howl incessantly, but without his pack to hear him, it was just more noise for the men in blue to torment him for the next day. For weeks and weeks, Rita's life was this cycle of hopeless rage, but once a week, the blue men would relent their poking of the wolf, and gather at the westernmost edge of the village that faces towards the craggy rocks of the lower mountainside. There they would leave one of the village's animals, be it a cow or a goat, and tie it to a fence post, marked with blue and red symbols. In the morning, the animal would have vanished, and the men in blue persisted with their normal behavior, but this ritual was never missed, and was carried out religiously once a week. It was on a night like this, 3 months into Rita's enslavement, that whilst howling towards the full moon, Rita heard a voice. "Why do you not relent?"
"Who are you?" barked Rita. "What coward whispers at the king from the shadows?"
"You are a king, yet you would rule from behind bars," said the voice, remaining calm despite Rita's provocation.
"How dare you? You would not speak so boldly if I was not imprisoned by these blue men. I am Rita the Fiend, Rita the Famished, Rita the Inevitable."
"I would speak to you any way I please, Rita, the unassuming," the voice chided. "But I have come to you, Rita the Inadequate, as a companion, not as an enemy, so that perhaps your gnashing and howling might be abated."
"Unassuming, inadequate. You suggest companionship, but speak to me as such. You are insolent. If I were free of these bars, I would.
But you are not, are you, Rita the unimpressive? Instead, you are at the mercy of these blue men, and only I have answered your shouts. So you would either have me or have nothing. Rita snarled and panted as if ready for a fight, but for a while his howls had been abated.
What might I call you then, coward in the dark?
You would call me Skogar, or Fjall, or Borg if you so desire, and you would treat me with some respect. I will come to your side this day once a week, Rita, and you may talk with me. But no, that threatening and snarling at me will get you nowhere.
You talk of respect,
Snapped Rita.
but I am the most fearsome beast to roam the lands of Midgard, larger and more powerful than the wolves that chase the orbs up above. Yet you demand my respect? What foul creature are you to demand such things?
Skogar's voice was quieter than Rita's, but somehow it carried threats that the chaotic echoing snarls of the wolf did not.
All you know, Rita the Bound, is that my voice shall be heard, my words shall be heeded, and that I will be here on this night every week, as surely as Hugin and Moonin watch over us now. Take my advice, Rita the Broken. Hide your jaws beneath your tail for now, and take the meat when it's offered. Allow these blue men to have their way with you, no matter how painful, for it is with reaction that they get their satisfaction. You will never escape, Rita the Dulled, unless you do as I say.
And with that, Rita heard heavy footsteps travelling westward, and then nothing.
Come back, you preacher of falsehoods, cried Rita. I would make you my prisoner as king. I would torment you endlessly. Do you hear me, Skogar? A thing such as yourself should be wise enough to know never to enrage a ruler as powerful as I. Do you hear me?
But by now, Rita was howling only to himself. The voice of Skogar was gone, and he was alone once more.